Hello, everyone. Welcome to this interview on doing sociology. Today, we have with us Professor Tulsi Patel, who was a professor in sociology at the Delhi School of Economics before retiring. She was also the rotating chair, India Studies at Heidelberg University, Germany in 2005 to 6, and honorary research associate at the Department of Sociology, University of Manchester. She has also undertaken teaching assignments at the London School of Economics and the Royal Holloway College of the University of London. Her areas of interest include gender, anthropology of fertility and reproduction, medical sociology, sociology of the family, and old age. Her books include Sex-Selective Abortion in India, Gender, Society, and New Reproductive Technologies, published by Sage in 2007, and Fertility Behavior, Population and Society in a Rajasthan Village, published by OUP India in 1995. We are going to talk about reproduction ethics and legality today with Professor Patel. Ma'am, welcome you to the platform and thank you so much for taking time out to do this for us.
Thank you, Rituparna.
Right. So just to begin with, the two books that I mentioned, and those sort of look at the question of reproduction. But before that, largely associated with women and as a women's issue, reproduction has not been central to sociological research. So could you tell our viewers about how it did become an essential area of academic research, and what are some of the major trends now in studying reproduction?
Oh, very interesting but large question. So what I felt conducting this research was, and post conducting this research are the two things that I need to mention. While conducting this research, I was not only collecting anthropological data as well as quantitative data in terms of family size, number of children born, etc. It was an interest also because, and I reflected later on, that my generation is a generation in India that was brought up on the constant idea of scarcity of food and population size increasing in India. When India became independent, Nehru had said that we have 36 crore population and 36 crore problems. So population was actually constructed as a problem at the political level, at the national level. And those who had smaller families were the people who were nationalists, patriotic. And those who were not were the people who were illiterate, uneducated, rural, poor, etc. So there were two categories of Indians. The better off ones who did not have very large families or did not want to have too large families, and the others who did not bother about the largeness of the family. Apart from this, what I studied in school and the debates that went around scarcity of food, etc., with Lal Bahadur Shastri coming in later and saying that you should fast once a week, and I was one of the persons who did fast once a week because Shastriji had said this. So developing my childhood and reflecting upon my childhood at that point, I did realize that most of the couples at that time of my parents' age were having 5 to 6 to 7 to 8 children, which today you might be astonished to find, but that was more or less common to have 5-6 children per couple. So I got interested in exploring this work because when I started my work in the 80s for research, it was still considered as a major problem as far as India is concerned. Population growth was considered one of the major hurdles in the growth of Indian society or the development of the country. So it was at the macro level a consideration of too many people. And as a social anthropologist, when I went in to look at this, the kind of literature that was available was from economists, demographers, statisticians, where population was considered as part of the debate where development is obstructed because of population growth. that kind of debate. Though Karan Singh at one point in one of the World Population Conferences said that contraception is the best, development is the best contraceptive. So it was actually from a very left-oriented or a Marxist kind of position that this phrase came, that development is the best contraceptive. But if you look at the family planning program in India, right from the beginning, the focus was on planning small families. So when I had this piece of information with me before going to the field, I was looking for why people have so many children, or why do people have the number of children they have. And it was my anthropological sense or sociological sense, which develops from the kind of education that you get in the Delhi School of Economics. I got interested in the meaning of children, meaning of parenting, what it means to have the number of children people have, what it means to be born, what it means to give birth. So the power of being a child, the power of being a progeny, or the power of being an offspring, and how that power not only lies with the baby or the infant or the newborn, but how the growing up, the birth itself and the growing up of the child, initially the baby, the infant, and as the child grows, how it's not just the power that the child carries in being the child, but how the power is also transmitted to being a parent, to the parents. So the idea of the family, the idea of the child, the idea of growing up, the idea of parenting, these became important dimensions to reflect upon. And it is in this light that I continued my research and tried to see the meaning that is constituted in people's minds in the idea of what a child means and what parenting means. And in that sense, what the interest in reproduction became an interest in family, household, parenting, growing up, forming a household, etc. And the idea of the status of women was important here, and that is where the gender and reproduction link became important. So from the idea of development and population, development of the nation and population growth, the micro idea was the birth of a child, the status of women, and the link between the mother and the child, and how this link between the mother and the child is oriented or navigated through the idea of the couple, the married couple, the couple in the family, not just the household or not just the married couple. So it is in this light that I got interested in the idea of reproduction, and reproduction and gender became important to me and later on to many other people. But just as Sonaldi Desai had in one of the lectures, she was commenting about how when my book came out from Oxford University Press, that was the only book on India on population which had anthropological demography. It was looking at demography anthropologically. So the meanings of population became meanings of people. What does it mean? People are not population. People have a different meaning compared to the meaning of population. So from aggregate figures to the micro level figures of members of the family, relationships, kinship ties that they have with each other, etc., become important, though politically and economically, these are important both at the family level as well as at the macro level. So that becomes a far more complex issue of how reproduction is tied with gender, relations, family, and then the community, the kinship group, etc. That is how I prefer to look at it.
Thank you for that answer, ma'am. Ma'am, could you also talk a little bit about clinical ethics in reproduction in the practice of surrogacy and decision-making in various procedures? Since you have conducted empirical research in New Delhi, who would you say makes these decisions regarding reproduction?
Yeah, again go back a little bit historically, because the work I did on fertility in rural Rajasthan had given me a broad canvas of looking at how decisions are made. Because the family planning program that began in India was a program that looked at planning families, meaning controlling the size of the family. And the idea of the small family has varied over time, but the blame was always put on the woman, that she is the one who is producing these children, and the need is to control her. And the conjunct idea with this was that because the young woman is a daughter-in-law in a joint family, it is the mother-in-law who is influencing her to have more children. And a lot of research has been done which shows that the mother-in-law influences the reproduction. And this kind of influence has also gone to right to abortion studies. So whether it is right to abortion or right to have a child, it's the mother-in-law who influences. But in my research, I found that it is not just the mother-in-law. The woman's mother herself is also equally interested in the fact that she should have a baby after marriage. It's very rare to find a mother who would not be interested in her daughter, her married daughter, not having a child, at least in the Indian context. So it actually puts the whole thing upside down, where it's easy to point out that the mother-in-law is actually forcing her to have, or pressurizing her to have a child or have a baby or have a larger family. But the mother-in-law perhaps is the conduit through whom the larger family or the household, the family, the kin group influences her. And in my fieldwork, I found that mothers as well as mothers-in-law, even elder sisters, were concerned if a woman did not have children. And the cases that I found with women who were not having babies or who were not able to reproduce, the kind of pitiable state that these women were in was brought out later by people like Marcia Einhorn in their work on infertility across the globe. So infertility has been seen very differently in different contexts, but by and large, infertility is not something that is to be celebrated. Is a prevalent notion, and that's the understanding. So in that sense, reproduction becomes even more important. And my work in surrogacy in South India, I've done field work in Hyderabad also, and in New Delhi as well, in fertility clinics, surrogate hostels, very briefly in Gujarat, but largely in Hyderabad and New Delhi. Issue of ethics is very important, and in one of the papers that we wrote together, because this was a joint research, there are ethical issues around the new reproductive technology and the use of the technology. And in that sense, questions of who makes the decisions are important. And here I would reflect upon the idea of informed choice. When we talk of informed choice in any medical context, let alone reproductive, the knowledge that medical practitioners practicing in India have and the kind of conversations that they have varies across clinics, across types of clinics, across cities. The difference that I find between medical practice in one city in comparison with another city are very, very sharp, very striking. The doctors would not speak in some contexts or speak very little, and they assume that they know everything. And you wonder whether the doctor has understood your disease. So this idea of informed consent is something very important. But in terms of how in surrogacy this works is how the doctors would maybe discuss a little more with intended parents who want to have a surrogate baby in comparison with a surrogate, because largely there is a class difference. in commercial surrogacy that has been prevalent in India, and my research has been on commercial surrogacy because altruistic surrogacy was not something that was in practice when I did my fieldwork. In fact, in one of the conferences we organized at JNU, the doctors who were participating in the conference were saying that there are a lot of people who do not have enough money to support a surrogate or to pay to a surrogate, and they have family members who would love to be surrogates, but that's not something that is permissible. So there was some problem, but it was very clear in ways in which many people had sold their fields, homesteads, etc., and had tried to become or hire surrogates. So it was an economic proposition and a very prohibitively expensive idea and provision. But when doctors decide, because of this inequality where the poorer person is a surrogate compared to people who are paying for the surrogate or the intended parents, the intended parents seem to get a little more detailed information from the doctors in comparison with the surrogate. The surrogate in the Indian context, even if in the bill, the ICMR had informed in the bill, it was a guideline 2005 onwards, that the surrogate and the commissioning parents should meet and decide on their own the payment, etc. But in all the clinics that we went, the surrogate and the commissioning parents never met. There was actually the clinic who was mediating between the surrogate and the clinic and the commissioning parents. The agents who are not in the bill at all were existing very much as the central of surrogacy industry. They were the ones who would get surrogates. And this question that you raised about who decides reproduction, who decides, doctors do a lot of decision when it comes to technical issues. How many eggs to draw, what kind of hormones to inject, etc. These are discussions which are not done with surrogates or with commissioning parents. The only thing is they would perhaps tell commissioning parents that we are going to plant 5 embryos or 3 embryos, even if the guidelines say that not more than 2 embryos. So there are ethical issues as well as guideline issues. So what the policy decides or policy framework guides the doctors and the medical practitioners is at one level, the actual practice is at another level. Within the actual practice, the hierarchy is such that commissioning parents get to know a little more than the surrogate. The surrogate does not decide whether she wants to have 3 embryos implanted or 2 embryos implanted. And beyond that, the surrogate also does not know if there is elimination of embryos. So if there are 5 embryos and all the 5 survive after implant, it's not possible to have these 5 babies because it's too dangerous for the surrogate. So some of them are removed, eliminated. Now this elimination process is done by the doctor. The idea of informed consent is not even considered in this case. So most of these decisions are technically made by doctors who think they are making very fine decisions, very right decisions. But if you look at the manner in which decisions are made, the information or lack of information with the person who's becoming a surrogate, then the question is a more serious one. And that becomes a more ethical question than how doctors practice technical decisions. So in that sense, a lot of these decisions are made by medical practitioners. A lot of these decisions are made by commissioning parents. For instance, the commissioning parents in these clinics actually in some way look at the surrogate, or they're able to, from a distance, see a range of women who and pick up their choice in terms of who they want the surrogate to be. And very often the blame on eugenics, the blame on priorities, how there are physical traits which commissioning parents look at. So if commissioning parents want a pair surrogate, they would not prefer to have a dark surrogate. If the commissioning parents want somebody who should look like a South Indian mother, then they would prefer a South Indian surrogate. If the commissioning parents are North Indian, they would like to have a North Indian surrogate. So the larger context in this ethical problem is that the surrogate is being decided by the commissioning parents. The surrogate does not decide who the commissioning parents will be for her. She doesn't make that choice. So this is a choice which is mediated through the clinic, but it's not a technical choice. The technical choice, as far as the clinic is concerned, is whether she health-wise and other biological parameter-wise, she is considered appropriate or she qualifies to be a surrogate. So those qualifications should be important, and that is what the clinic would look at. But beyond that, a lot of other things, the social, the appearance, the biological, are also decided by commissioning parents, not by the surrogate. She is not the one who would decide who are going to be my commissioning parents or for whom I'm going to be a surrogate. So this inequality exists within the surrogate industry. And this is certainly an issue which is very different from how it happens in Western countries, especially those countries where surrogacy is altruistic, where a relative, a friend would decide whether she wants to have a baby for a friend, etc. So it becomes very different how these two work. And it is in these crevices that one would look at the ethical issues, both at the technical level, medical level, and at the social and physical level. So it's in that sense. And then how it is all enveloped in the economic framework.
Right, ma'am. So, my next question is on the question of sex determination. Now, this is something which has been much debated in India, and of course, there are laws also surrounding it. But our question to you is on fetal sex determination technologies. So what are some of the questions that have shaped the experience and the study of human reproduction with specific reference to fetal sex determination technologies in India?
Yeah, very good question. When I was doing my work on fertility and the number of children people had, it was clear to me in many ways that there is a bias in the favor of the son. Most patrilineal societies have that bias, whether it is manifest very clearly or not. In the rural setup that I worked in, it was fairly manifest. So one could see that there is less preference for daughters and more preference for sons. And it's there available even in the nomenclature. So in my work, I have tried to show that how if the child is a female and born after a few females are born, the kind of name she would be given would make it very clear that she's not a desirable one, or that parents don't want to have more children. So this term called China in Bangla or Itishri sound very, very interesting names, but they are conveying that that's enough for the parents, or she's not a wanted one. Now, China or Itishri would not be names for boys, unlike girls. So boys, even if it is a third boy or a fourth boy, would never have that name. But daughters may be given those names. First daughter is more acceptable than the second and third. And this was also brought out in the sex ratio work. Census came out, the demographers were very happy, they were overjoyed that sex ratio numbers were getting in favor of women. Not in favor, I would not say in favor of women, but from 930 per 1,000 men, it became 935. So a rise of 5 women per 1,000 in the Indian context meant a large figure as far as census officials and demographers were concerned. So it was a positive sign that things were improving. But it is in the 80s that new reproductive technologies came. It is also in the 80s that gender and reproduction for Indian feminists became an important issue. Until then, the middle class that constitutes the Indian feminist leadership was not so much interested in reproductive issues and gender relations, except that young women are having to reproduce too many children and they should be made to have smaller families. Over time, even the meaning of smaller family has been different. So in the early 60s, early 50s, 60s, when people were having really large number of children, the idea was to have 3 children. And 3 children was considered as a small family. The portrayal of these children in billboards and many of the government programs under family planning program were showing 2 sons and 1 daughter as a small family. You see the sexual bias here, the gender bias in terms of what a small family is in the minds of planners. But to think of how sociology, society, or its representation or its planning is also a matter of times. How over time things change, how over time meanings change. And it is in the 90s that you find it is do, hum do, hamare do. So from 3 children, it becomes 2 children. And here, hum do, hamare do is not 2 daughters or 2 sons, but 1 daughter, 1 son. So for about 20 years, the Indian population, reproductive population has generally been exposed to this idea of 1 son and 1 daughter as a small family. It is only in the 2001 health policy and family planning policy that you find have fun with 1. And constantly there has been an economic undertone in this to say that the family budget will be improving if you have few children. So the notion of small family itself has changed. By the 90s, with neoliberal opening up of the Indian economy or opening of the Indian economy itself threw up a huge number of changes in the Indian society. The idea of middle class and a growing middle class, a middle class that is more consumption oriented, has been visible in the Indian context. Material for consumption is also more available. So your generation would not have seen the kind of things that you have huge lines outside the mother dairy waiting for the milk to arrive or for the butter to arrive, etc. It was not available in polypacks for you to pick up on the go. Now, this kind of change that came out in the Indian society also saw change towards accepting newer technologies. Surrogacy, of course, is one of them. But new reproductive technologies was seen as something alarming by the Indian feminists. So while the Western feminism was emphasizing on how medicalization of childbirth is not good, Indian feminism was still wanting to move childbirth from home, from the rural to the clinic. So safe motherhood, safe abortion, institutional childbirth, etc. was still a priority. But it is at this time, in the early 1990s onwards, that the interest in reproduction and gender gripped Indian feminism as well. So while the Western feminism wanted naturalization of birth or natural births compared to clinical births, the Indian feminists wanted clinical births, safe births. So the concerns were different. But what concerns the Indian women and the Western women in common was the use of new reproductive technologies and how these new reproductive technologies were not actually in favor of women. They were in some ways going against the interests of women, against the bodies of women. Most of these new reproductive technologies, even contraception technology, which was available for long, and people like Germaine Greer, etc., many feminists have fought against it. But it was interesting to see how all these technologies were used on women's bodies compared to men's bodies. Even today, the kind of contraception that you have is more for women than for men. And when it was used for men during emergency, Indian government fell. Parties lost. So politics and reproduction are not just at the level of the family. Politics and reproduction are far, far more deeply ingrained and connect the macro and the micro. In that sense, I see my relationship with my research being very important and growing up from one point to the other. So at one level, when I was looking at the family size, how this influences later on the kinds of developments that took place in the realm of reproduction. And more concerned, every time I went abroad, I found that people were more concerned, especially academics, social scientists, and feminists were more concerned about reproduction and women and that relationship than it was in the social sciences in the Indian context. But with new reproductive technologies, it became important because it was feared by people like Veena Majumdar and others. In contrast to economists and statisticians, that these technologies would be harmful for women. They would go against women. And while the 81 census said 935 women every 1,000 men, it was also in the 1991 census, when the analysis of the census was done for literacy, not for sex, for literacy, it was found that 0 to 6 years was kept out of literacy, 7 and above were considered for being literate or illiterate. But 0 to 6 age was available for statistical analysis. And because it was available for statistical analysis, sex ratio became easy to calculate. So 935 was the sex ratio overall. And when the sex ratio for younger population, 0 to 6 years, the children was considered, it was found that there were too many women, girls missing. And people like Amartya Sen have talked about missing daughters. So it was becoming clear. People like Ashish Bose and others who have done more research, demographic research, found that the preference for birth order by gender is very, very clear. By the time it is a third daughter, it's not even 500 per 1,000. So obviously, daughters are disappearing somewhere. And then the technology was seen as this amniocentesis, where the fetal testing was available. And there is this very famous incident reported by Veena Majumdar that when more than 1,000 samples from All India Institute of Social Science, All India Institute of Medical Sciences in Delhi was doing a research on amniocentesis. These over 1,000 couples who were sampled and the women were pregnant, they were provided information about the sex of the baby. And half of the women who were carrying females wanted to abort the females. And abortion is something which came to India more easily than for the Western women. Because the white Western middle-class woman was something that the population establishment wanted to reproduce more compared to the black. So black women in many Western countries got contraception more easily than the white women. But here it was not race or caste in that context. It was more gender. So the stratification between the West and the rest has been very different, and particularly South Asia. So it is here that my interest in sex-selective abortion became important. And practically Oxfam approached me after the 2001 census to do a study in the Bundelkhand area, which are parts of UP and Madhya Pradesh. And for the first time when I went to Jhansi, I saw people carrying guns and rifles on the street, walking, motorcycles, jeeps, whatever it may be, but they were carrying guns. And the view of that, or the vision of that, when I recall, I had never seen so many rifles on the road carried by people before this. We went to people's homes, and the village headman or the sarpanch would sit on a charpai with a rifle next to him. It was a different kind of society. But I was doing this work with NGOs, and very often when NGO representatives or staff were brought in for training, some of the other male would accompany women who were coming from another district or far off. Women were not moving alone. And it is here that the NGO staff told me that there are female infanticide cases for newborn babies in hospitals. So even if there is a safe birth that is being conducted institutionally and in hospitals and clinics, there are cases where women are being discriminated so much that the mother herself wants to kill the baby. And in one case, one of the NGO staff members was in tears because her elder sister, who had born a second daughter, was told not to come home from the clinic. She would come home to the clinic only if she didn't have a second baby with her, who was a daughter. And that was very alarming. And from there, we picked up this research on sex-selective abortion. And it is something which has continued for long. Even during the pandemic, there have been cases reported of female sex-selective abortion being attempted, and some of the patients or the doctors and clinics were caught red-handed, but very few actually get convicted. And there is work by people like Vijay Laksminanda on pre-birth elimination, and a lot of work by feminists, Tulsi Patel, Renuka Dagar in Chandigarh, and a lot of people have contributed to this edited book on sex-selective abortion in India. I was also on the PCPNDT committee, State Appropriate Authority member, which is a 3-member body. As a social scientist, I was on this committee for several years in Delhi for the Delhi region. And attempts at clinical, at sex-selective abortion or examination of the sex of the fetus attempted by people from other states who would come to Delhi. And because of the anonymity that they get, it was easier for them to get an abortion, to get an examination, sex determination of the baby and an abortion than in their own cities or towns. But it was something which was very widely available. Now, this is something which is a bothersome issue. It is dangerous. And because we don't have the latest census, we can't really say what is happening. But my fear is that because there are very, very few convictions, it might be something that is still being practiced. And very often what happens with stricter laws is that practices go underground. They become more expensive, but they continue, which is unfortunate. But I hope that just as China is now facing this huge scarcity of females, and I can see how Patels in Rajasthan, now that I've shifted out of Delhi after retirement, how Patels in Rajasthan, who had exchange marriages about 50, 60 years ago, are now reverting to exchange marriages. So if you have a daughter, your son is likely to get a bride. But there is hypergamy. Fortunately for sociologists, I don't have to explain this, but there is hypergamy. And it is interesting. You would be surprised to find that there was a case in Haryana of a man who was married to an Odia girl from Odisha. Both of them did not speak each other's language. But because Haryana boys find it very difficult to get local brides, this Odia girl was his wife. He had a daughter. When the daughter was 1.5 years old, he got a government teaching job because he had done a B.Ed. After joining his work, he took his wife on a train to say that we are going to your parents, and that was it. The wife never came back, and the parents told this boy that now that you have a permanent job, you would get a local bride with dowry. So while Haryana men would not find brides, sometimes they would have to share brides between brothers. But if you have a permanent job or if you have an economic base, it is possible to find brides. And that is the marriage squeeze. And that is the hypergamous influence of marriage on gender and gender relations. So it's far more complex. It's not just technology, but how technology is socially and culturally enveloped.
Right, ma'am. So the last question is sort of connected because we were talking about new reproductive technologies and of course sex determination. So now the assistive reproductive technologies bill has been passed, right? So how do you see the impact of it in the kinship situation and reproduction in India now, since the bill has already been passed? And what would you think would be some of these sociological factors that we can look forward to?
One is that the bill has been prepared. It is waiting in the Rajya Sabha. It's not turned into an act. Yeah. But the bill is now passed by the Lok Sabha, waiting in the Rajya Sabha.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Right.
Now, despite this bill, at the informal level, the manner in which some of the surrogacy practices were happening in India continue to happen, except that foreigners are not able to come here and have babies. The Article 377 will be a difficult issue because the Supreme Court and the government goes back and forth on 377. So whether same-sex couples or single parents would be able to have surrogates to produce babies is going to be an issue. But sex-selective abortions is not part of this surrogacy bill. That's part of the PCP-NDT Act 1994 and its amendments, various amendments that have come up later. So that is one issue. The other issue is of the surrogacy and surrogacy bill. From commercial surrogacy to altruistic surrogacy might pose several familial, kinship, and sociological issues. One is that in my research with some of the colleagues in South India as well as New Delhi, we found that surrogates were not absolutely poor because such poor women would have poorer health and they would not qualify to be surrogates. You have to have a certain amount of or a certain extent of healthiness in terms of biological parameters, including two natural babies born to you to become a surrogate. So it's not completely emaciated or pauperized women who become surrogates. But unlike what a large number of studies have shown from NGOs and journalistic studies, that it is the mothers-in-law who push the women to become surrogates. That's not the case. Whether it was in Gujarat or in New Delhi or in Hyderabad, in none of these places we found women being pushed to become surrogates. It was women who could convince their husbands that surrogacy is not an immoral act. They're not sleeping with someone to become mothers. It is, in Delhi, it was said that wo pani ki boond se doctor bachche paida karte hain. So the doctors would tell that, pani ki boond jaise dalte hain, वैसे बूंद डालेंगे और आपके बच्चे ठहर जाएगा पेट में. And most of them were indebted. So they were poor, but not extremely poor. They were indebted. and they were doing it for economic reasons. When it comes to altruistic surrogacy, with fertility having come down to replacement level, more women are being employed, more women are becoming educated. How many women would be willing to become surrogates for their relatives is a big question. Sorry, can I have some water?
Yes, ma'am. Sure.
What I feel is that this question of surrogacy and the kind of clauses that the surrogacy bill has come up with is a very moralistic position that is being taken, where the notions of Victorian sexual morality are actually influencing the bill. So rather than commercial surrogacy, altruistic surrogacy is seen as desirable. But the moral understanding or the moral perception behind this is that producing a baby for somebody else is not a great idea. In that light, adoption is a greater idea. But when it comes to the Indian context, adoption is not seen as a priority. Here, the element of how science and nature come together. So while this nature and science has been separated in all technical and technological advances, as far as reproduction is concerned, the more separation between nature and culture through technology, the more emphasis on nature and naturalizing the technological product. So naturalizing gametes, naturalizing eggs, naturalizing semen, naturalizing the sperm is important. It is so important that a lot of women who were commissioning parents in South India and in Delhi did not want to know or did not want to let their mothers-in-law or other family members know that they were commissioning babies. Even for IVF, a group of students in Delhi University in the Department of Sociology who had studied IVF practices were saying that people come within Delhi, they come to clinics which are 30 kilometers, 35 kilometers away from home, not letting their family members know that they are going to have IVF babies. IVF baby itself is something that is kept a secret. How will surrogacy become altruistic is a big question. So sociologically, it is an important issue.
Right. Ma'am, do you have to add anything?
Well, I would only say that one small, very casual observation, but a consistent one that I observed is a lot of Western students from anthropology would come to India, particularly the Delhi context I'm reporting. And these anthropology students would be interested in reproduction and would want to do some field work on reproductive issues. And some of the NGOs would ask me very often, because I worked on reproduction, as to why these Western students are interested in reproduction, but not the Indian anthropology students. Indian anthropology students are not so much interested in reproduction. Now that with new reproductive technologies and surrogacy would change a great deal. Indian feminism and Indian social science students are now very much interested in this issue. And I hope that with the higher education, the problem of gender and reproduction, the problem of sex-selective abortion reduces. So this is something which I would like to add.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. And thank you so much for talking to us. I know it's been difficult, you've not been well as well, and it's very cold in Delhi. So thank you so much for doing this. It was truly an honor to have you. And those of you who don't know, she was also my professor in the school during my master's, and it was so good to see you again. So thank you so much from me and Dipali and our team as well for talking to us.
Thank you, Rituparna, Dipali, and the whole team for having me to interview with you and to bear with my voice that is faltering so much. Thank you.
No problem at all.